L.A.G, or Latent Automaton Gangrene, is a short story written and performed by David Lawson. We hope you enjoy L.A.G, Part 3. Jenna wished there were words to describe the all-engulfing sludge that seeped into every crack, crevice, hole, or break in her heart, like a toxic buildup of alluvium. Her body continued its arduous, boundless campaign, independent of her mind. Jenna's physical frame continued to move in an artificial artifice, a faux facsimile, a carbon copy of life and the living. But her soul had succumbed to the pain of death the absolute instant her child and husband had been torn away from her life. I always knew when he died, I would too. I didn't realize my body would just keep going, though. Jenna had made several attempts to end her own temporal life, but she would never follow through. She hated herself for her weakness. She loathed her husband for fleeing to his death. She abhorred the ones that took him from her in the first place. Quite suddenly, and possibly an eternity ago, Jenna found that her body had run into something, or someone. She couldn't be sure. She wasn't even sure that she wasn't sure. Whatever it had been, it just snapped one of the marionette strings that pulled her body independent of her own free will. She was now aware enough to comprehend that she was barefoot and bloodied. A small red outline of her foot was smeared in haughty crimson across the pavement, where she had stood moments before the string in her mind had snapped. Jenna was unable to pull enough coherent memory from the depths of her brain to reconstruct whose blood it was. She didn't believe she had the wherewithal to attempt murder even if she desired it. Without her consent, Jenna's body began moving again. Whatever part of her consciousness had resurfaced was not enough to do anything other than observe. Her body took another lumbering step forward, and then another, or at least it tried to. Jenna almost laughed in amusement as her entire world went from vertical to horizontal. It took her a moment to process, but Jenna surmised that her waiting in place as long as she had allowed the blood at her feet to pool just enough for her to slip. She was fairly certain that her head banged against the pavement once she landed, because a series of several more strings snapped. Now she could feel her own body, and it was agonizing. Her feet felt as if they'd been run through a blender. Each searing, agonizing cut, just a small piece in the intricate tapestry of pain that was her body. Something was wrong in the way her left shoulder sat. Jenna pulled from older memories that weren't hidden behind a wall of physical and mental pain to deduce that it had been knocked out of socket somehow. The shape of her head felt wrong to her. She was unsure if she had simply morphed it halfway into something else, or if the blow had caved it in or inflamed part of her skull in the back. Jenna had the perfect understanding that she had the physical ability to heal these wounds all at once. She could even disconnect the pain receptors to her brain to think more clearly, but not enough strings had broken for her to will her body to obey her mind. Honestly, do I even want it to? She asked herself as she lay bleeding from several places onto the street. Perhaps my body is doing for me what I never could, letting me die. She sat in silence, unflinching and unaware of anything but the small pool of blood flowing outward from her body. It was as if she were giving her own life to the world around her. She needed it no longer. I wonder if they even want to see me, Jenna mused. My love, Gwen, I was born nearly 30 years ago, but I didn't start living until I got to know you. I finally had a family of my own. Beautiful baby girl. Thoughts unbidden rose from the ether to her consciousness. The more of her body she regained, the more of her mind revolted against her. She remembered sharing her precious yogurt with her husband. She also used to morph herself into the smallest crevices possible to play hide-and-seek with Gwen. Jenna could almost smell the spices he would put on the steak he cooked for her. He always got imported seaweed so that it would taste like home. She remembered the ever-cool touch of the skin both he and their daughter had, and the small freckle-like scales she would run her fingers across in the night. She would never forget how his arms held her, as if she were even more precious than the artifacts he collected. the tender strength he showed her in moments of intimacy and playfulness. The exact look of terror he discovered he was going to be a father was something she would never forget, nor how brave he had been in encouraging her every step of the pregnancy. He had even come to save her when she had been kidnapped for their precious Gwen. He would never come to save her again, and she wished she were dead. A gurgling blubber escaped her lips, tinged with phlegm and blood. She spat on herself as she began to wail into the endless abyss of the space above her. My husband and child are dead or gone, and I will never see them again. Great maker of the universe and the angels, my family is gone. My mother and father are gone. My child is gone. I know I've asked for so many things before, but if you'll allow me one last request, let me die here, please. I can't live life forever like this. I really am so grateful for the 3 years of living that you gave me. But if I have to live the rest of my endless lifespan without them, I'm begging you, kill me now, please. Just let me go home. I need to snuggle with you and just get some rest. Jenna felt a rush of relief as her vision went black, and she entered into a peaceful sleep. She would no longer have to worry about the pain of this world, because she was leaving it. Or so she thought. All at once, every last string about her snapped. She had both full awareness and control, and it was mortifying. Immediately, she began to dry heave repeatedly. Jenna had been in a chair, but in her reaction she had flung herself from it onto all fours, attempting to empty the contents of her stomach. Thankfully, or regretfully, she had nothing to empty. The floor remained pure, but the filth and poison inside her could not be removed. She coughed and sputtered for several more moments before she felt a pair of hands on her back. Jenna whipped around and scurried backward several feet in a flash. "Who are you? Where am I?" She wiped her mouth as she spoke. "Don't touch me!" she ordered before the hooded figure could speak. The figure made no moves to come any closer, instead raised its gloved hands. Jenna could tell from the shape of the figure and the fingers on the hand that it was a humanoid. Though what she could glean from that, Jenna was unsure. Sometimes she looked humanoid as well. I wonder what I look like right now. She didn't dare take her eyes off the hooded figure. The figure removed her hood to reveal a younger-looking human girl with long, flowing auburn brown hair. It reminded Jenna of the last burning embers of a campfire as the girl brushed it back to flow behind her quite nearly to the floor. The young lady's face was the embodiment of youthful beauty. Her blue eyes sparkled with unmitigated optimism only the naivete of youth could offer. She's at just the age where she's showing womanly beauty, Jenna thought to herself. Exactly the type that would have captured my interest 4 years ago. Things are different now. "Peace, friend," the young woman's voice almost sang. "My name is Marifold, and you are safe in the house of our father." Marifold kept her hands raised and made no attempt to move closer. Jenna dared to steal a glance at her surroundings. They were indeed in what looked to be an ornately decorated cathedral or chapel, windows that seemed to be made of actual stained glass, and various other ornate religious symbols were scattered around the room. As a vanguard, Jenna had come into contact with a number of different religious sects and denominations during interfaith disputes on the satellite. However, either due to her haste in looking, or the fog still tightly clamped around her mind, she couldn't place what religion these symbols went to. After waiting for a time, letting Jenna struggle to take in her surroundings, Marifold offered another start at conversation. "Some of my brothers and sisters found you outside. I know not what caused your wounds, but you appeared to us in dire need of aid." She placed her hands together and lowered herself onto her knees to be at more eye level with Jenna, who remained half sprawled with her back leaned against the far wall. "We are not healers of the flesh, but we offered what aid we could." Marifold extended one of her hands to point at Jenna's feet. Jenna examined herself for the first time since coming to, and now both saw and felt the wrappings placed around her feet. It was an amateurish attempt at stopping the bleeding, but what it lacked in elegance it made up for in function. Scanning further up her own body, Jenna saw that she was in her house clothes. Nothing more adorned her rainbow-colored body than a loose pair of shorts and an oversized tank top that had belonged to her husband. It used to smell like him, she couldn't help but think as she felt the material between her fingers. Maker, why didn't you just let me die? Tears unbidden streaked down her face in warm, slimy trails. This was not the soft crying of a quiet pain, but rather the putrid and ugly weeping of a soul in its death throes. Jenna's shoulders shook, while snot streamed from her nose. She lifted her head upward and wailed like an animal, till her voice ran raw, and her throat burned from the effort. When her vocal cords finally betrayed her, she slumped to the ground, too exhausted to even mourn. She wasn't even sure when Marifold had quietly moved over to her and placed her gloved hands around her. I know not your pain, miss, but I will see it through with you. Jenna pulled away at first, but Marifold held on to her with a surprisingly solid grip, and Jenna was too weak to pull away. You needn't fear, miss, Marifold said. We would never alert the vanguards to what has happened. This place is safe from their kind. The woman softly pet Jenna with one hand, as she whispered in a comforting voice. She thinks I'm a drug addict, Jenna thought. She instinctively reached for her vanguard badge and gun, but in her stupor she had left the home without either. And they don't know who I am, she realized while biting her lip nervously, unsure of how to proceed from here. Silently, she began working to form a functional eyeball in her right hand. In the meantime, Jenna continued speaking, hoping to keep Marifold distracted. What kind of church is this? Marifold continued to stroke Jenna softly as she answered. It is a safe place where you can be yourself. We do not discriminate against anyone here. Uh-huh, Jenna grunted in a distracted manner. Her talent in morphing had always been mixing and matching parts where they didn't belong. She was still very weak from blood loss, and eyes were complicated. But what sect are you? A lilting melodic laugh left Marifold's lips once the question had been asked. Oh, sweet miss, how delighted you will be to hear our message. We are a church beyond sex or denomination. All who have faith are welcome here. Shifting snake shepherds, I hope she's not a universalist. As these thoughts drifted quietly through her head, Jenna felt the synapses from her new eye connect to her brain. She quietly closed her two primary eyes and turned her palm to face back and upwards towards Marifold's face. With a familiar yet foreign motion, Jenna willed her new eye to open and look back at her savior's face. From this lowered angle, Jenna could now see under Marifold's long bangs and gaze at the young woman's forehead. As if to mock her hopes, Jenna could plainly see the square-shaped tattoo with two curved slashings going through it that marked her as a universalist. She cursed under her breath in disappointment. Jenna had never had much patience for universalists, even as a much younger woman. If you accepted absolutely everyone and everything, then what was even the point of being accepted? It also meant you had to discard the notion of right and wrong as far as she was concerned. Universalists had helped aid criminals escape the vanguards more time than she cared to count, all because of their idiotic philosophy of always helping the needy, even if the needy included killers on the run. Jenna closed her eye on her hand and cupped her fingers into a fist to cover it as she returned her arm to its normal function. She knew that she needed to get out of there before someone recognized her, but she wasn't even sure where here was. Best case scenario, someone recognizes me as a vanguard and calls them to pick me up. If that happens, I'm going to have to get a real psych eval, and I know I won't pass. Jenna rubbed her eyes with her left hand, half to assuage her mounting headache and half to prepare for a quick escape if she decided it was necessary, by placing her arm near Marifold's. The worst case scenario is they view me as a danger to the needy, and some of their more radical charges decide to stop me before I can stop them. Without my gun and with all this blood loss, I don't know how well that would go. Marifold took in a deep breath and in a soft voice offered Jenna another choice. Would you consider listening to the sermon today? After that, we have a meal, and perhaps we could talk about calling someone to pick you up. Running Brook. He could get me out of here in one piece. Jenna's mind raced. I can't call someone now? Marifold finally released Jenna and allowed her to turn and face the younger girl. Our speaker has asked for religious reasons that we activate a local electromagnetic field. This will ensure our minds stay safe in the thoughts of God, and that the enemies of God will be kept out. Or so any illegal activities can't be monitored, Jenna thought more pessimistically. But after this meet and greet, we can call my friend, right? Jenna again bit her lip nervously, searching her surroundings for any sort of escape route. That would be most wonderful, miss, Marifold smiled with the earnest cheer of a child. I am sure any friend of yours must be pleasant company indeed. Jenna mumbled something incoherent under her breath and offered no further response. Come, the sermon will begin soon, miss. Before Jenna could think of a further response, Marifold had taken her hand and begun to lead her off through the compound toward where the sermon was being given. Jenna continued to look every which way for some route which she might escape in a pinch, but every door they passed led only to another enclosed room from what she could tell. This place is laid out like a falcon maze, she thought with a growl. I do not mean to pry, miss, but perhaps we could get to know each other even better if you gave me a name by which I may call you? Marifold asked with an ever-hopeful smile beamed at Jenna. Kyra, Jenna offered. It had been her sister's name, but her sister had accepted the snake's death trap as salvation like the rest of her family. So far as Jenna knew, it was up for grabs. It's a lovely name, Miss Kyra. Marifold laughed with joy, as if every passing moment was a new wonder in and of itself. I have seldom seen one so bright and colorful as yourself, even in this mishmash of people that we call the satellite. Might I ask what a wonderful world could give rise to such a natural beauty as yourself? Oh yeah, I would have liked this one in my past life. Now, however, the bright-eyed lass, flowing with compliments, was nothing but a source of anger for Jenna. A roadblock, keeping her from getting her job done. Her job, that she was on leave of absence from, sure, but did anyone ever truly quit their job? Not if they're any good at it, Jenna reminded herself. I'm from an ocean planet, one of the ones that accepted the deal, she finally admitted. My parents were of different races, and that's why I'm so colorful. It was half true. Her parents were of different races, but her genetic makeup wasn't from either of them. Due to a recessive gene that had laid dormant in her mother's DNA from her grandmother, it had awoken in Jenna, changing her DNA so she was like neither her father nor her mother, nor any combination between them, but instead like her grandmother, a woman who could shapeshift at will. Thankfully enough, the believability of Jenna's story remained high due to the way half-breeds often turned out. Often two races were compatible enough to have children, but the results were also often very interesting. Deformities or other odd mutations were the common results of the union between two different races. A rainbow-colored humanoid without a tail or webbed fingers, even coming from an ocean planet, wasn't so outrageous as to be unbelievable. All the same, Jenna took a moment to begin sculpting superficial gills on the side of her stomach, hoping no one had looked there while she had been unconscious. If anyone doubted her story, she could simply point to her gills as evidence of her heritage. Marifold slowed her pace before turning to face Jenna. The young woman squeezed her hand tighter, and Jenna began to worry she'd been found out until Marifold spoke. I am so sorry, Miss Kyra. I cannot imagine the pain you must be going through. To have lost an entire world. I can't imagine your sorrow. Jenna unsuccessfully tried to hold back the wellspring of emotions from spewing out of her. As tears rolled down her stone-still face, a million different glib and defensive responses sprung to Jenna's mind, but the sincerity with which Marifold showed her sympathies left Jenna unable to vocalize any of them. After a few moments of silence had passed, Marifold once again squeezed Jenna's hand, before leading her to the sanctuary. Jenna barely paid any attention as they sat down in preparation for the sermon. She thought the room could hold perhaps 100 people. She also found it strange that for a church that espoused a view of accepting absolutely anyone and everything, to have such a low number of non-humans present. Her mind could not continue to make so many observations at the pace it was, however. Even as she sat down, Jenna felt the marionette strings wrapped themselves around her hands and feet again. The spindrils of spiderweb cocooned her in a deadening trance she couldn't shake. Even as part of her mind screamed that she was losing herself again, Jenna could only sit passively as the world passed her by in an increasingly blurry picture. Marifold was kind enough to sit with Jenna near the back of the congregation, but Jenna's mental stupor had grown too thick for her to even tell when the sermon had started. She thought there could have been singing or chanting of some kind. It was impossible to be sure. Jenna was beginning to wonder if she would ever break out of this mental prison again, when a sudden yelling snapped several of the strings tied to her head.
What did you think would happen when we tried to play God?
A booming voice screamed at a pitch and volume that seemed far too high to be correct.
Were we not given the traditions from the mouth of God himself? Were we not warned?
His screeching rose to unbearable levels, but it had shaken Jenna from her trance, and for that she was actually grateful. I'm sorry. I think I dozed off. What is he screaming about? Jenna asked a very uncomfortable-looking Marifold. Our guest speaker is sharing his views on the outbreak of latent automaton gangrene that has started showing symptoms across the satellite. His belief states that because the automatons were created not by a supernatural being, but instead by physical ones, that they are an abomination against God. Jenna blinked and shook her head. The rest of her body wouldn't move like she wanted, but from the neck up she seemed to have regained control. That seems pretty bigoted coming from the Universalist Church, she said with a sarcastic edge so sharp it could have cut glass. Why is he allowed to speak here exactly? He has been oppressed by the followers of the angels, Miss Kyra, Marifold whispered in a tone much lower than Jenna's. Our mission is to lend help to the needy and oppressed. Even if he wants to oppress someone else? Jenna was more than fed up with this situation at this point, but her body remained locked in place. It is not my place to tell others how to live, Marifold whispered in a voice so low Jenna could barely hear it. Despite the girl's obvious discomfort with this topic, or perhaps because of it, Jenna retorted with an increase in volume and vitriol. Well, it's not his either, Marifold. Several heads turned to face the two of them, and the speaker stopped his ranting to look for the commotion. Marifold seemed to shrink into herself as she slowly raised her hood. Meanwhile, Jenna finally managed to snap enough of the strings to stand up.
Do you have something you wish to add, child?
The way he emphasized child made Jenna's blood boil, especially since this man couldn't have been more than 5 years her senior. Her mouth began to move before her mind could filter. The only addition that could save this mess would be a brain, and mine's not for sale. Sorry. She had added the sorry at the end once her mind had caught up with her mouth, in an attempt to soften the blow. But on the tail of such a brazen insult, it came off every bit as disingenuous as it was.
You mean to cross wits with me?
The man shouted at her in a haughty tone, his white robes and blonde hair only serving to accentuate how red his smooth face had become. No, of course not, sir. Jenna was already committed, and she wasn't about to back down now. I would never strike down an unarmed man. The man laughed, his voice and face both full of rage, perhaps even intent to kill. But Jenna didn't flinch. She had faced much worse countless times. And besides, she thought, I'm already dead. What more could I possibly lose? Marifold did not share Jenna's bravery, however. The petite woman quietly stood and placed her gloved hands on Jenna's shoulder. Miss Kyra, I beg you, apologize and sit down. Many members think as he, and I couldn't bear the thought of blood being spilt on such holy ground. Marifold pulled at Jenna to have her sit, but Jenna would not relent. Without turning away from the speaker, Jenna shrugged off Marifold's hand. When the tiny woman again tried to pull Jenna back, and this time with more effort, Jenna took her own hands and pulled Marifold's off of her. In the effort, and quite by mistake, Jenna dislodged Marifold's gloved hand. Several members of the congregation gasped in surprise, though Jenna didn't understand why. It's not like I shoved her hard. Jenna glanced back at Marifold, and at once the crowd's shock made sense. The young woman clutched her ungloved hand, but 4 metallic fingers still stuck out from the grip of her gloved one. Why wouldn't she try and get some artificial skin to cover those prosthetics? Jenna's thoughts began to race. More importantly, why is everyone so upset by her having them? It's not what you think, Marifold squeaked nervously as she backed away from the sermon giver, and the crowd of people who had gathered in the aisle. She tripped over her own robes and curled into a defensive position. Unless, of course, they're not prosthetics. Jenna's mind went into overdrive. Marifold's behavior during the sermon, her metallic hands, her devotion to universalism, her unnatural attractiveness and unbelievably pleasant and passive personality. They all pointed to one conclusion: an illegal companion automaton. Somehow she escaped here. Seems at least some of the church didn't know till now. Jenna looked at Marifold's glove, still clasped in her right hand. And I just outed her. In the middle of an anti-automaton sermon. Oh, Falk. Evidently, the rest of the congregation had put 2 and 2 together. Stares and murmuring broke out across the nearly 100 humans as they not only pieced together what had happened, but whispered about what should be done. It seemed to Jenna this anti-automaton rhetoric wasn't new, and it had found acceptance in some of the church's mind. Jenna could see the righteous anger on the speaker's face, the way some of the crowd gathered around him and looked at him for instruction. She looked back at Marifold, who cowered before her, still clutching at her artificial arm, as if it would attempt to choke her if she let it go. The situation was clear to Jenna, and now so was her mind. She shook the rigid strings of the stupor from her body and settled into a fighting stance. Jenna didn't have her gun or badge, but she could become a living weapon. and she didn't need any government authority to protect an innocent girl from being torn apart. "Stay behind me," Jenna said to Marifold as she began to focus on reshaping her arms. She imagined the length of her arms splitting and her bones being lengthened into fang-like teeth on the tops and bottoms. What she was aiming for was something very much like a reptilian mouth. Inadvertently, the image of a tongue and humps for eyes also formed along her arms. "Snake shepherds, I wish I was better at exact imaging," she mentally cursed. "Whatever, this'll work." The extra mass for bones had come from her pelvis and rib cage, but she had mentally clumped her vital organs tighter together in those areas to minimize her weak points in combat. "If you want to dance with the young lady, you're going to have to go through my friends first." Jenna snapped her arm mouth shut in asynchronous fashion to drive home her threat. "You act like you've never seen a shapeshifter before," Jenna spat before realizing most of them probably hadn't. "All right, listen here, you inbred, scale-eyed falcon faces. These are my snap traps. Real bone, sharp as iron, mind you, makes up the teeth of these things. I can change their shape and size at will, and my will is starving for some colt meat right about now. So the next one of you so much as touches us." Jenna took her right snap trap and bit down on one of the chairs a row ahead of her, instantly eviscerating it into countless shards of wooden debris. "You got that?" she yelled wildly, trying to come off as intimidating as possible. Many of the closer members scurried away in absolute terror, tripping over themselves and their fellow members to get away from the crazed, shape-shifting rainbow woman. The sermon giver looked neither impressed nor intimidated, much to Jenna's chagrin. His face was twisted into a haughty and self-righteous smile as he looked down at Jenna and Marifold. Even from such a small stage, he loomed larger than life over the frightened pair of women.
"One abomination defends another from the righteousness of God. Surely we are in the end times."
He stepped down from the stage and began pulling at his robes.
"As the scripture says, the very rocks shall call out as the abominations try and hide from righteous judgment."
"Not in any scripture I've ever read," Jenna snarled.
"But we know that the true rock is the church of God,"
he continued, completely ignoring her.
"And with this rock we shall crush the abominations unto death."
Having finished his little speech, the man fully disrobed, revealing a mechanical exosuit emblazoned with a giant red falcon underneath that symbolized his devotion to the dark angel known as the Falcon. "Falk," she thought. "Come get some," she said, opening both snap traps wide. The falconer ran at them, screaming a battle cry as at least 20 of the congregation charged at them behind the man. He leapt into the air as the suit expanded over his limbs and face, and he aimed to come crashing down on Jenna. With expert timing, Jenna flung her arms upward and closed both snap traps around the falconer's hands. "Gotcha!" she grinned as he hung in the air impotently.
"Crap, my teeth can't get through the armor,"
she hissed with anger. "At least I held him in place, though." With an animalistic growl, the falconer swung from his position and drove a newly armored foot into Jenna's chin. Jenna stumbled back and fell near Marifold, who lay still, shaking where she had fallen earlier. Jenna elbowed the woman, trying to get her attention. "Do you know how to turn off the field and get a call out?"
What? I don't understand, Miss Kyra,"
Marifold stammered. "Do you or do you not?" Jenna yelled as she forced herself back to her feet.
"I think so, Miss Kyra,"
Marifold responded as she crawled back from the falconer and the approaching mob.
"Then send an emergency call to the vanguards. Tell them we're here and that Jenna's asking for help." "But what about you?"
Marifold gasped as the falconer wound up for a mech-powered haymaker. Jenna twisted her body in such a way that she was able to close her right snap trap around her attacker's hand and twist. This knocked her opponent off balance and sent him careening to the left and into more chairs. "You saved my life once today. Now it's my turn to save yours." That was all the time Jenna dare spare, for the mob was on her now. Several of the congregation had grabbed the wooden chairs around them as weapons, and the attacker closest to her had raised one to bash Jenna with. She reached up and slammed a snap trap down on the chair. A shower of splinters rained down on them both, and the man fell back from the shock, knocking several other attackers over. One, however, had managed to get behind Jenna and hit her over the back with a chair. Jenna nearly buckled under the force of the blow, but managed to stay upright. Without even looking, she twisted her left arm around and clamped her snap trap down on the attacker's shoulder. The woman let out a screech of pain as the claptrap's teeth perforated her skin, but Jenna didn't have an ounce of sympathy in her for the woman trying to murder her in cold blood. "She's lucky I didn't kill her," Jenna thought briefly before releasing her grip and turning back to the mob at hand. "There are more of them than I can handle, but I can at least slow them down." She swiveled back around, ready to face the onslaught of attackers coming from her, But to her amazement, none were on her. Instead, several other members of the congregation had rushed to her aid. Jenna grinned, overjoyed by her good fortune. She was then immediately impacted by the mech-armored falconer. While she tumbled to the ground, Jenna flailed her left snap trap, desperately trying to get a solid grip on the falconer. Her bone teeth scraped along the metal plating, but did not offer her a solid position from which to grapple her opponent. Instead, the falconer managed to get his mechanically augmented fist around the base of Jenna's left elbow, where her arm ended and the snap trap began. Jenna wound back to strike him with the snap trap attached to her right hand, but the falconer slammed his fist into her face with such force that everything went black and her body fell limp.
Rejoice, for in wiping you from existence, I will further purify the world of evil.
The falconer raised his mech's mask to reveal his bloodthirsty grin and hungry eyes, looking down at her with a haughty disdain. Jenna sputtered before finally regaining her voice. You are cartoonishly evil, you know that? If I die, so what? I'm not going to let this fool take my dignity. The falconer only laughed at her rebellion.
Abominations will always call good evil and evil good. Such perversions must be erased, so that the flock be not led astray.
Jenna was winding up another retort to keep him distracted, while she started reforming her left snap trap into a lightning-fast muscle that would expel long shards of bone at her command. Almost got it. With a scoff, the falconer lowered his arm with as much concern as if he were swatting an insect. Of course, the effect was not so mundane. Instead, his metal-plated arm slammed through Jenna's arm. The appendage let out a cacophony of cracks and pops, as flesh rent from muscle, and muscle tore from bone. Jenna's vision went red, and she thought that she might have been screaming, but there was too much pain to tell. When her vision cleared, her left arm was missing from the elbow down, and blood dripped from the tattered mess that remained.
Falk,
she whimpered as her body entered shock.
Though you use it in vain, the name of my God will be the last words your lips shall taste, abomination.
He held onto her disembodied, half-formed arm in one hand, and raised the other, preparing to strike her down. Is this really so bad? Jenna wondered through the shock and pain. Every day, I beg for death, and now that it's finally here, why do I fight so much? I have every reason to die, and this seems as good a place as any. My husband abandoned me. My child is dead. My family cowered and embraced evil as my entire life was torn apart. Everyone I ever thought I trusted left me here to rot. So why should I bother living? If life is nothing but betrayal and pain, what's so good about living, huh? Even the angels, our guardian brothers and sisters, have left us to fend for ourselves. So, give me one good reason not to give up here and now. Because I love you. A voice from so deep within her, Jenna wasn't sure it was her own thoughts. Because I love Marifold, and I sent you to save her. Jenna was too stunned and confused to speak. Time didn't seem to be moving right. I'm too broken, she thought she might have spat out loud, though she couldn't be sure. I do my best work with broken people, her creator whispered from within. I put them back together, better than they started. It's always the darkest before sunrise, her husband had told her. She'd hated that saying. It was a patronizing euphemism, and scientifically incorrect. Yet now it seemed to make a sort of sense to her. Her body was numb from shock, but her heart warmed from the words bubbling up within her. Put them back together, she thought as the spark of an idea lit within her. Time returned to its proper speed, and Jenna leapt into action. First, she flipped forward, dodging the powerful strike of the falconer. While her opponent was still off balance, Jenna spun and willed two thin streams of flesh, carrying countless pathways for nerves along it, to come from her bloodied stump. While her opponent was still off balance, Jenna spun and willed two thin streams of flesh, carrying countless pathways for nerves along it, to come up from her bloodied stump. With a slightly sickening squish, the nerve ending stuck into the flesh of her hand. With a twitch, Jenna sent signals from her brain through the two strings of nerves attached to her severed hand. In an instant, a number of protruding bones shot out from her flesh into the face of her attacker, gouging out both of his eyes. The falconer dropped her arm and screamed, flailing wildly as he crashed into the crowd of people around him. Blood poured from his face as he pulled frantically at the bone shard still protruding there. Jinna immediately set to work reattaching her arm and forming it back to its normal shape. She had lost even more blood and some bone mass from the fight, but she knew she could always replace it later. Assuming I can stay conscious, that is. The world swam around her, and Jinna was unsure if she was stumbling or if the trauma was affecting her vision, but she knew she wasn't stable. She had a controlled fall to her knees, and then finished reattaching her arm enough to stop the bleeding. She frantically tried to continue the resculpting of her arm before the trauma rendered her unconscious, but simply attaching the arteries was more than she could manage to complete. Despite her best efforts, Jinna slumped forward onto her good hand, desperately attempting to keep herself propped up. She tilted her head up to see 3 followers of the Falcon who had slipped through the crowd to attack her. "Come at me, you bird brains," Jinna mumbled as she tried to push herself up. Her arm lost its strength and she collapsed onto her face from the effort. "I'll take you all on," she grumbled, face first into the floor. "I tried my best, Maker. I really gave it my all. I'm tapping out now, though. Your turn." Using every ounce of her strength, Jinna turned to look up at her attackers. Perhaps they would be her killers. "The ground is shaking," Jinna noted through her blurry vision. "Or is that me? I can't really tell." A roar shot through the haze of her mind, and a giant mechanical being came into her vision, leaning over her in a threatening pose. "Back for more, Falkface?" Jinna might have said. She blinked rapidly to clear her vision, and faced the falconer with as much determination as she could muster. As her vision cleared, she was met with not the sight of the falcon attacker, but a giant roaring mechanical bear, complete with a small pink bow attached to her head. "Grizzle!" Jinna laughed out with drunken delight. "You're better!" The creature was no less than 7 foot while crouching, and with one massive metal paw, she batted away all 3 attackers who would dare harm her Jinna. "Baby child, I wish I could say the same for you. Look at all this blood! Honey, what have you gotten yourself into?" Jinna couldn't help but smile as Grizzle scooped her up in her paws. "I was really worried about you, you know? How did you find me?" It was an effort to even speak now, seeing Grizzle had given her a 3rd win. When Grizzle had smashed those 3 attackers back into the walls, most of the fighting had stopped in its tracks. Behind the giant mechanical bear, more vanguards stormed in to make sure the fighting dispersed, and likely arrested everyone until it could be sorted out. "A very nervous child called us, and I just happened to be able to get here the fastest," Grizzle explained, rocking Jinna back and forth as if she were a child and not herself a mother. Was a mother. Jinna mentally corrected herself. "As for how I got better, I have some very good news." Grizzle gave Jinna a fang-filled grin. To anyone else, it would have been the stuff of nightmares. But to Jinna, it was a comfort to see her old friend smiling again. "Before you tell me, Marifold, the small frightened girl, is she safe?" Jinna asked. "That girl? I believe so. Her arm looked as if it had been on fire moments before I arrived, but she didn't seem bothered by any of it. Looked like it was made of metal anyhow," Grizzle said with a thoughtful look on her face. "The more I think about it, it was probably a prosthetic." Jinna let out a sigh of relief. "Can we keep her separate from the others? I'd like to keep her safe." "Of course, hon," Grizzle affirmed. "Soon as we get you fixed up, we'll take you to visit her." Jinna snuggled into Grizzle's metal torso. Under normal circumstances, it wouldn't be what she considered comfortable, but the presence of a friend meant more than anything to her right now. Grizzle leaned down and nuzzled her head slightly. "Now about that good news,"